Thanks, Archie, and thank you, friends, for being here. Thank you, Jane, for inviting me to participate in this. I think that's a sincere thank you. We will see as the afternoon goes on. We've got a lot to do, and I want to launch straight into it. The purpose of the paper that I want to share with you now is, as best as I can, to set out my understanding of the Bible's teaching on this difficult subject of marriage breakdown and the consequences. I find myself more deeply conscious than usual of the inadequacy of my efforts, aware of the painful complexity of the issues as Philip has set them before us in a very clear and powerful way this morning, a complexity that at times overwhelms me. I speak not as an authority on this subject, but as one deeply concerned, as I know we all are, to please God and do what is right before Him as we reflect His righteousness and His grace in our lives and in our care for those around us. I'm somewhat comforted that you will not mistake me for a scholar. Whether I'm a Pharisee looking for loopholes, you'll have to judge. The subject is important. In Christian circles, a great deal of thought is often rightly given to a biblical understanding of marriage, to the encouragement and support of strong and faithful marriages, and to helping marriages to overcome difficulties and threats. We think and talk less about the situation where a marriage fails. We all wish that such situations did not arise, but they do. And it is simply irresponsible to put the subject in the too hard basket. One of the things I thank Jane for today is that many of us recognise that we have been doing that, and we've been doing it for years. If I can share with you one of my own failings, Philip and I have not spoken on this subject. We haven't talked it through, and even in preparation for today, we didn't sit down for a week, as we really should have, and talk together, and not so that we'd be saying the same thing, but so that we'd serve you better. It's just been too hard. It's been too hard for decades, but we can't do that. And although I would have preferred Jane to have organised discussions to be a little bit more private than it's turned out to be today, it's got to happen. And if you're a pastor, you must think this through. And you must come to the best understanding you can of the teaching of God's word, and you must then practice what you have learnt. Why is it so difficult? We've said a lot about that already today. Can I just share with you what I've already prepared, because I'm incapable of ad-libbing, which repeats some of the other things. But first, it is painful. And it's painful particularly if we have friends or loved ones who've experienced a broken marriage. Since personal relationships are more precious than anything else in life, and marriage is fundamentally important in God's purpose for humans, in my view, a broken marriage is a tragedy second only to death. The hurt and the damage done to all concerned, their family, especially children, of course, and to wider society by the breakdown of marriages is incalculable. We cannot think and speak about this subject unemotionally, and the emotions are painful. Second, because the subject of marriage breakdown, broken marriage, whatever words you want to use, is so sensitive among us, we have tended, as I've indicated already, to avoid thinking and talking about it. The result is, in my opinion, profound confusion among us. We tend to think that righteousness pulls us one way and grace pulls us another. That cannot be right. The righteousness of God is the grace of God. The grace of God is the righteousness of God. But none of us finds that easy. Third, our confusion is likely to be divisive. Brothers and sisters, we cannot afford unnecessary division. We ought to hate it. Can we discuss this subject openly and honestly without making differences divisions? We have to. Fourth, the Christian thinking about this subject faces particular challenges today. And again, Philip, in his inimitable way, has helped us to see that with great clarity this morning. Our society attempts to live in denial of the tragedy of broken marriage, and consequently is unwilling to pay a high price to protect and preserve marriages. There is far more concern in the world around us about the harm and hurt of a so-called bad marriage than the damage and awfulness of a broken marriage. This is a big and costly mistake. As in many other areas of life, our church life must be radically countercultural in its valuing marriages, working hard to guard against marriages breaking, displaying the goodness of persistent faithfulness through suffering. Christians are cautious, as we should be, about anything that might seem to undermine our commitment to marriage. It's very difficult in this context to think carefully in Christian terms about marriage breakdown, to go beyond the true conviction that it ought not to happen, which was so wonderfully expounded for us this morning. Nonetheless, as I've said, it is necessary to do so. Marriage breakdown is a sad fact of church life, as it is of the wider society. Christians must not respond to society's denial of the tragedy of failed marriages by a denial of our own, a failure to think through honestly and thoroughly in the light of God's word, how are we to understand and respond to the tragedies in our midst? More particularly, how are we to honour and love brothers and sisters who've suffered the breakdown of a marriage? Let me begin with an attempt to summarise the conclusions that I have drawn from my understanding, and I'm afraid you'll make various judgments about whether Archie was right about the emphasis in this paper. There might be a little bit more emphasis on my understanding than there ought to be, but that's what you're getting. These are the conclusions that I've drawn. I'm not saying this is the Bible's teaching, but these are the conclusions I have drawn from my understanding of the Bible's teaching in a sort of semi-systematic way. 9 points, and they're printed out on the notes. 1, marriage is intended by God to be a lifelong and exclusive relationship between a man and a woman. 2, outside the garden, all marriages are marred by human sinfulness and weakness. 3, nonetheless, husbands and wives are obliged before God to do all in their power to honour God's purpose for marriage. Failure to do so is common, reprehensible, and harmful. 3, however, in our fallen world, circumstances can arise in which it may not be possible for a marriage to be lifelong. The most obvious and perhaps the most common circumstance involves the unfaithfulness of one partner. There are other such circumstances. 5, therefore, in our fallen world, God has allowed divorce. That is, the ending of a marriage before death. 6, this provision is often abused. That is, marriages are terminated that need not be and should not be. This is a reprehensible failure to honour God's purpose for marriage. 7, however, divorce is not always reprehensible. It has been allowed by God with a recognition of our hardness of heart, that is, our fallen sinful natures, for those situations where it is not humanly possible for a marriage to be lifelong. 8, the Bible does not provide a legal or quasi-legal definition of all the circumstances for which God has allowed divorce. It requires godly wisdom, not law, to discern what is right in any particular situation. And 9, divorce ends a marriage. Therefore, a divorced person is, in principle, free to marry another. There is no more inherent virtue in a divorced person remaining unmarried than a person who has never been married. You look down those points, I think you'll agree that points 1, 2, 3 and 6 asterisked are uncontroversial among us. I suspect that it is with 4, 5, 7, 8 and 9 that I've got some explaining to do, yeah? And that's what I will now try to do. looking at the Bible's teaching first about marriage and then about divorce and remarriage. It is a remarkable fact, Philip touched on it this morning, that the Bible contains no specific information about marriage ceremonies or even an explicit indication of what is needed to establish a marriage relationship. In the great body of God's law for Israel, there is much that presupposes the goodness and the importance of marriage, but nowhere in the law is there a prescription of what must be said or what must be done to make a man and a woman husband and wife. However, the place of marriage in God's purposes for human beings is seen from the beginning, and Genesis 2 verse 24 in its profound simplicity stands as the Bible's basic description or definition, if you like, of marriage, reiterated as it is at key points in the New Testament. Therefore, a man shall leave his father and mother and hold fast to his wife, and they shall become one flesh. The focus is on two actions of a man leaving his father and mother and holding fast to his wife. The bond to parents is replaced by a new bond. A new family unit comes into being, a new one flesh. I'm going to move quickly over these because we've looked at these things this morning, but I just want to set them up as the framework for some of the things that we need to see a little bit later on. The goodness and importance of the marriage relationship as the Creator intended it is wonderfully underlined by the fact that it proves to be an anticipation of the relationship that God will establish between himself and Israel, the fulfilment of which will be seen in the relationship between Christ and his church. But what is the nature of the relationship we call marriage? What, in other words, does one flesh mean? The Bible does refer to marriage as a covenant. There are a number of references there that you can look at. And the key vocabulary of Genesis 2 verse 24, the holding fast, the cleaving and the one flesh language is used of other covenant relationships. I would argue that marriage is a covenant relationship. That is, at its heart, is a binding agreement involving promises and obligations. Now, of course, the reality of the relationship of marriage is more than the covenant on which it's based. Just as Israel's relationship to God was more than a written code. Promises call for trust and faithfulness. And in marriage, this involves profound physical, emotional, and psychological union. All of this seems to be entailed in the expression one flesh. However, I'm not persuaded that one flesh means something more, and it's hard to get the right word here, but something more metaphysical, something more ontological, a God-created union that cannot, as distinct from ought not, ever be broken. This is a fundamental point, and a fundamental point of disagreement between my own understanding and that of the indissolubilist position. Marriages described in the Bible, subsequent to Genesis chapter 3, are all outside the garden, and therefore marred by sinfulness, by weakness, by bondage. Marriages now suffer such factors as selfishness, arrogance, greed, violence, and deceit, which make even the maintenance of a marital relation difficult, let alone its happy and harmonious functioning. Marriages remain very important in God's purposes for humanity, but there are now profound departures from the Creator's original purpose. And so we encounter polygamy, adultery, homosexuality, sterility, and of course marriages that fail. The Bible recognises the fact of broken marriages and the outcome that we call divorce. A bit more on that in just a moment. But what does the Bible say about these things? Well, just as it is surprising to find that the Old Testament law contains no detailed provisions for establishing a marriage, it is perhaps even more striking that there is very little legal material regulating divorce. What is divorce? When, if ever, is it right? Does the Bible teach that there are legitimate grounds for divorce? If so, what are they? Those who approach the Bible searching for answers to these questions often find texts that seem to provide answers. But do they? A starting point, but by no means a knockdown argument, but is simply to observe, Philip made this point too this morning, that the Bible does not have a word exactly corresponding to the English divorce, with its clear legal connotations. In English Bibles, the word divorce represents a number of words in the original languages, none of which means divorce, none of which means precisely what the English word means. The table you have in front of you, I won't work my way through it, but it shows the words in the Hebrew and Greek Bibles represented by the word divorce in the ESV, with an indication of the usual meaning of each word, a gloss. In these contexts, the ones listed here with these words, the words do refer to an action that brings a marriage to an end. But the important and surprising point is that the Bible doesn't prescribe a legal framework for these actions and doesn't have a technical legal term for the act of ending a marriage. And this means, for example, that the clear distinction in English between separation and divorce is much less clear in the Bible, since the vocabulary used in the Bible could apply to either or both. I will, however, continue to use the term divorce in the following discussion as a convenient term, meaning it to refer to an action that brings a marriage to an end, recognising that this does beg certain questions. A second observation. It's striking that nothing in the Old Testament law could be regarded as a general prohibition of divorce. To be precise, the actions referred to by the various Hebrew terms were noted in the table, driving out, sending away a wife and so on, are only ever prohibited in very particular circumstances. The law certainly puts restrictions on divorce, but does not prohibit it. Third, the Old Testament law does not define the circumstances that would allow divorce to occur. Fourth, there are no penalties prescribed for a divorcer. Fifth, on the other hand, a husband is never required by God's law to send his wife away. That might not surprise us, but if we knew the world around, it would. In contrast to other ancient law codes, no circumstances are ever described in which a divorce must occur. Indeed, the book of Hosea, we find a potent testimony to the power of grace and forgiveness to restore a broken marriage, and just how good that is. So what does the Old Testament say about divorce and remarriage? I've attempted a summary. In certain particular circumstances, the Old Testament law does not allow divorce. So, for example, in Deuteronomy 22, verse 19, a man who has falsely accused his wife of not being a virgin when he married her is forbidden from ever sending her away. Similarly, same chapter, verse 29, prohibits a man who has forcefully taken a virgin from ever sending her away. These prohibitions applied to the specific circumstances described suggest that there was no general prohibition of sending away. If there were, these laws seem to me to be sort of superfluous. They may have been particular applications of a general law, but it seems to me that a more natural reading is that these are the circumstances in which this must not occur. The Old Testament law does not the Old Testament law does not allow certain particular remarriages to occur. That is, marriages, of course, involving a divorced person. The famous Deuteronomy 24 is a case in point. We'll come to that in a moment. According to Leviticus 21, verse 14, a priest may not marry a divorced woman. He also, according to the same text, may not marry a widow. It does not, of course, suggest that a widow may not marry someone else, nor, in my judgment, does it suggest that a divorced woman may not marry somebody else. Some take these restrictions on the remarriage of divorced persons as an expression of a problem that there is with all remarriages. I think this is unreasonable. There are particular reasons that disallow some remarriages in Old Testament law. When these reasons do not apply, My impression is that the Old Testament passes no negative judgment on the evidently common practice of remarriage. There are certain provisions in the law where a man who has wronged his wife is required to allow her to leave him. Deuteronomy 21, 10-14, a man who takes a woman captured in war as his wife must let her go free if he no longer delights in her. The man may not treat such a woman as a slave. It's reasonable to assume that the woman in such situations would be free to marry another man. Such laws must be interpreted with some caution because the principles of war, slavery and marriage are all involved in very complicated circumstances. But my point is simply that the Old Testament does not appear to have the assumption that divorce is never allowed, or that remarriage after divorce is in principle problematic. Deuteronomy 24 verses 1-4, the famous passage, famous particularly because of its appearing in the debates in the New Testament, illustrates several of the points that I've made. This passage forbids a man who has sent his wife out of his house with a certificate of departure or certificate of divorce from remarrying her if she has entered into a subsequent marriage. The logic of the passage is set out on your notes. I'll read it to you. When a man takes a wife and marries her, if, 1, then she finds no favour in his eyes because he has found some indecency in her, and he writes her a certificate of divorce, a certificate of departure, and puts it in her hand and sends her out of his house, and she departs out of his house. And if, 2, she goes and becomes another man's wife, and 3, the latter man hates her and writes a certificate of departure, a certificate of divorce, and puts it in her hand and sends her out of his house, or if the latter man dies, who took her to be his wife, then her former husband who sent her away may not take her again to be his wife after she's been defiled. For that is an abomination before the Lord. And you shall not bring sin upon the land that the Lord your God is giving you for an inheritance. Time doesn't allow us to go into all the details of this text. I've tried to draw out what seem to be the most pertinent for our discussion. 1. This text must not be understood as either approving or disapproving of the act of sending away described in verse 1. However, Jesus said, apparently with Deuteronomy 24:1 in mind, but he could well have had a number of other texts in mind, because of your hardness of heart, Moses allowed you to release your wives, but from the beginning it was not so. Matthew 19. Point 1. Point 2. Despite a long history of debate, Deuteronomy 24 must not be understood as defining grounds for divorce. It simply describes, in vague terms, the circumstances in which a wife is sent out of her husband's house. She finds no favour in his eyes because he has found some indecency in her. Now, whether what he did, his act of sending her away, was justified or not, is actually irrelevant to what the overall passage is saying. One way or the other, the passage would be saying the same thing and requiring the same thing. 3. What about that second marriage of the woman in Deuteronomy 24? I believe that this text does not prohibit or condemn it. The reference to defilement, in Old Testament law, sexual relations generally involve defilement. Legitimate sexual relations involve defilement. Leviticus 15 verse 18. Our text even appears to allow for a third marriage, provided it's not to the original husband. That's the one that's forbidden. Here is a particular situation in which a specific remarriage is not permitted. Is this an expression of a problem with all remarriages, or just this situation? I find the latter makes most sense. It seems fair to say that in the Old Testament, remarriage generally seems to be an accepted, even expected, although of course not required, fact after a divorce. Astonishingly, just as God is portrayed as marrying Israel, he is also presented as sending her away with a certificate of divorce. certificate of departure. Isaiah 50 verse 1, thus says the Lord, where is your mother's certificate of departure with which I sent her away? Or which of my creditors is it to whom I have sold you? Behold, for your iniquities you were sold, for your transgressions your mother was sent away. Likewise, Jeremiah 3, she saw that for all the adulteries of that faithless one, Israel, I had sent her away with a certificate of departure or divorce. Yet her treacherous sister Judah did not fear, but she too went and played the whore. The Lord speaks of himself carrying out towards the northern kingdom of Israel the action of the man in Deuteronomy 24 verse 1. Divorce, in Old Testament terms sending away, may be an acceptable action taken because the covenant has been broken. It seems to me only so can it be an appropriate image of God's treatment of Israel. I mean, it is inconceivable, is it not, to have God portrayed as an adulterer. Now, Israel was an adulterer, but God divorced Israel, and we have to take that into our picture of this, it seems to me. Now, nothing that I've said should lessen the horror of divorce. The Lord's sending away was a terrible act of judgment. It was terrible. Sending away is never required or encouraged. There are no circumstances in which a husband or a wife must divorce his or her spouse. Whenever grace and forgiveness can bring reconciliation, it is always better. Furthermore, it seems self-evident that divorce is open to abuse. The notoriously difficult Malachi 2 verse 16 seems to speak of divorce as an expression of hatred. That's how the ESV has taken it. There is a paraphrase that I've put on your notes, and the reference to the writer is there, that goes like this. And I think myself that this does catch the gist of what this verse is saying. If one hates and divorces, that is, if one divorces merely on the ground of aversion, says Yahweh, God of Israel, he covers his garment with violence. That is, such a man visibly defiles himself with violence, says Yahweh of hosts. Therefore take heed to yourselves and do not be faithless against your wife. However, importantly, we should note, because of the history of this debate, that the Bible does not actually say, it may imply, but it doesn't say, that God hates divorce. That has come into the vocabulary of the debate from an unfortunate mistranslation of Malachi 2:16 in the authorised version, which has been rectified in the ESV, the current NIV, the Holman and the Revised English Bible, the only versions I had on my desk when I was checking this out. It is my contention, if we turn now to the teaching of Jesus, that the most important background or context for understanding Jesus' teaching is the Old Testament. Here I'm in full agreement with Philip's remarks and even their forcefulness, that studies in intertestamental Judaism and views in the Greco-Roman world contemporary with Jesus may have their place. You can see neither of us are enthusiastic about this. But Jesus was deeply conscious of his relation to what we call the Old Testament scriptures. What is the relationship between the teaching of Jesus with regard to marriage, divorce and remarriage and the teaching of the Old Testament? In my opinion, this is a key question for us to come to terms with. How does Jesus' teaching relate to the Old Testament, where both divorce and remarriage after divorce are restricted, but are not in principle prohibited? Did Jesus introduce further restrictions or even prohibit altogether? I've found it helpful to distinguish three approaches. I hope this is a fair description of the three approaches, and they're not actually mutually exclusive. Approach one is the expectation that Jesus fills in the gaps in the Old Testament and provides the only legitimate grounds for divorce. Jesus' teaching is taken as filling a void and answering the questions that the Old Testament does not answer. This is classically argued by John Murray in his influential and in many ways very fine little book, Divorce. Approach 2 considers that Jesus raises the bar and teaches that divorce is never right, although that was not the case in Old Testament law. That is, he replaces some parts of that law with a new and more rigorous law. Now, this approach is perhaps best represented by the careful work of Heth and Wenham, Jesus and Divorce. My own view is that in this matter, Jesus does not enable us to do what the law did not do, namely to specify acceptable grounds for divorce, or to conclude that divorce is never right. In my opinion, Jesus takes us behind the letter of the law to the fundamental purposes of God for human life and gives an understanding far more radical than any amendment or addition to the law. I've called this approach 3. The result is not a new and clearer or more rigorous law, but a deeper understanding of the human heart and of the goodness of God's purposes for human life. This is consistent, in my view, with what Jesus does, for example, in the Sermon on the Mount with the commandment about murder. Anger, like murder, makes one liable to judgment. The commandment about adultery, looking with lustful intent, flirting, is adultery of the heart, and so on. Let's turn to the texts. And yes, Philip was right. I'm not going to look at Luke 16 because what is said in Luke 16 is also said elsewhere. It was only for the sake of brevity that I cut out my treatment of that. I'm so glad that he looked at that text with us this morning. Mark chapter 10, verse 2. And the Pharisees came up and in order to test him asked, "Is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife?" He answered them, "What did Moses command you?" They said, "Moses allowed a man to write a certificate of divorce and to send her away." Jesus said to them, "Because of your hardness of heart, he wrote this commandment." The context, hostile question. Typically, Jesus did not answer such questions directly. He took control of the conversation and shifted the topic. That is exactly what he did here. The Pharisees asked about the lawfulness of divorce. Jesus responded by asking them about what Moses had commanded. I think he probably had Genesis 2:24 in mind as Moses' command regarding marriage. However, the Pharisees answered by referring to Deuteronomy 24:1, interpreted as allowing a man to write a certificate of divorce and send her away. Jesus did not dispute that Moses allowed a man to take that action, but pointed out that this commandment of Moses was a provision for, with regard to, your hardness of heart. In other words, Jesus taught that a husband releasing his wife from their marriage was allowed by Moses because of human sinfulness. It was allowed for life in a fallen world where sinners fail, but it was not the Creator's purpose from the beginning, as Jesus will go on to say. 2 points. 1, broken marriages and divorce are part of the fallen world, life outside the garden. If we were not sinners, there would be no need for divorce, just as there would be no need for medicine, police, or soldiers. 2, it's also important to underline, this is a major contentious point, I understand. It's important to underline that if God's law allowed divorce, divorce is not itself necessarily sinful, although it is also necessary to say not necessarily sinful, but it can be sinful. It's not necessarily sinful to have medicine and police and soldiers, although such things can be abused. But God's law never gives permission for sin. You can't imagine Jesus saying, can you, because of your hardness of heart, Moses allowed adultery. What's the difference between that and because of your hardness of heart, God allowed divorce? Jesus went on to underline God's creation purpose for marriage, which does not include divorce. He said, But from the beginning of creation, God made them male and female. Therefore, a man shall leave his father and mother and hold fast to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. So they are no longer one flesh. Therefore, what God has joined together, let not man separate. Should we understand that Jesus here abrogated Moses allowing divorce? Some think so. You might not be surprised to hear me say, I do not. Rather, Jesus changes the subject. They wanted to talk about the lawfulness of divorce. Jesus insisted on talking about the Creator's will for marriage from the beginning. The Creator's purpose for marriage has not changed. And that's a much more important topic than the Pharisees' question. And in these terms, divorce ought not to happen. Not cannot happen, mind you. But a broken marriage is the breaking of something that God has joined. Don't do it. Did Jesus answer the Pharisees' question? Is divorce lawful? I don't think he did. He was, in effect, refusing to answer that question. Should we conclude from this that the provision Moses allowed is no longer allowed? That, it seems to me, is to make Jesus' words say what he refused to say. Sometime later, when his disciples asked him about this matter, Jesus, now presumably without the Pharisees listening in, said, "Whoever divorces his wife and marries another commits adultery against her. And if she divorces her husband and marries another, she commits adultery." Brothers and sisters, I think it's fair to say that your understanding of these words of Jesus will either determine or reflect your understanding of the whole issue before us. I think three questions are critical. 1, do these words of Jesus introduce a new teaching about remarriage and divorce? In other words, did Jesus mean a person may divorce their spouse, but if they remarry, then that's adultery? Remarriage is the problem Jesus was highlighting. Many think so. And this is then the biblical basis for regarding all remarriages after a divorce as at least problematic. Some add that behind Jesus' new teaching about remarriage is an implied new teaching about divorce, namely that it does not end a marriage, because the first marriage is inviolable. It is still, in some important sense, intact, despite the divorce. The remarriage then is literally adultery, quite specifically against the first marriage, which can't be dissolved. It's still there. And so when you enter into another marriage, that is literally adultery. In God's eyes, it is thought the man is still married to his first wife, the divorce notwithstanding. In my view, Jesus' words cannot bear such weight. In my view, Jesus did not introduce a new idea when he said, "and marries another," but was simply filling out what was normally involved in divorce. Divorce and remarriage is a single idea here. Jesus was commenting on divorce and remarriage as a package. It's divorce and remarriage that Jesus called adultery, not the remarriage as such. And this, in my opinion, is how Jesus' words would be understood, not because of the historical background, but against the Old Testament, where there is no concept of a divorced person remaining unmarried because he or she is divorced. Say that again. In the Old Testament, I find no concept of a divorced person remaining unmarried because he or she is divorced. Did Jesus introduce that idea? I'm suggesting that if he did so, then, in my opinion, he did so more obscurely than anything else he taught. It is then, I'm suggesting, inappropriate to treat divorce and remarriage separately on the basis of this text. Some argue, for example, that while divorce may be sadly justifiable in certain circumstances or unavoidable from the point of view of the one who is divorced by the other, remarriage is never acceptable. This view is not supported, on my understanding, of this saying of Jesus. Well, in that case, what is radical about Jesus' words? The prevalence of divorce and remarriage in Jesus' world and in ours is scandalous. Generally speaking, it happens because a husband or a wife wants to opt out of their marriage so that they can opt into another. That's what most divorces I know are like. And Jesus says, the legal niceties, and of course they are rarely nice, do not make this right. You abandon your marriage in order to enter another, then that is the same moral category as adultery. It is unfaithfulness. The question remains, if divorce and remarriage is generally an act of unfaithfulness, is it always so? Are there exceptions to the general rule? Since God never allows adultery, does he still allow divorce and remarriage? We turn to Matthew's record of Jesus' teaching. Matthew 5:32, but I say to you that everyone who divorces his wife, except on the ground of sexual immorality, makes her commit adultery. A better translation I'll comment on in a moment, a much better translation, in fact a correct translation as opposed to a false translation, makes her to suffer adultery. And whoever marries a divorced woman commits adultery. And then 19 verse 9, and I say to you, whoever divorces his wife except for sexual immorality and marries another commits adultery. Before we get to the except bit, we need to ask whether in these texts Jesus rather more obviously says something new about remarriage as such. Some consider makes her commit adultery just that. How could a man divorcing his wife thereby make her commit adultery? How does that work? And what's often suggested is that makes her commit adultery refers to the subsequent remarriage that this woman is most likely to enter. I hope you can see there are all sorts of problems around that approach, and you will not be surprised to hear that I don't agree with it. There is a translation problem, and it is the question, how should we translate the very rare passive voice of the Greek verb to commit adultery, to be adulterated? All right? I take it to mean that the woman is the victim of the adultery. She has suffered adultery in the sense that she is the one against whom adultery has been committed, the one to whom the adulterer has been unfaithful. This is then entirely consistent with our understanding of Jesus' words that we've already considered in Mark 10. The man who releases his wife makes her to suffer adultery precisely because he has been unfaithful to his marriage in the sense that we saw in Mark 10 verse 11. But what about whoever marries a divorced woman commits adultery? Is this where we find the new teaching that all post-divorce remarriages are problematic? If these words still belong to the context of Jesus' general teaching of divorce and remarriage as an expression, generally speaking, of unfaithfulness, is he not simply implicating all involved in the moral equivalent of adultery? See, I'd paraphrase this statement along these lines. He who marries a woman who has divorced her husband in order to marry him commits adultery. I don't myself think that Jesus' words should be applied, for example, to a situation where a man marries a woman who was divorced many years earlier in circumstances in which he was not at all involved. Now, as I'm sure you'll see by now, I'm suggesting that the radicalness of Jesus' teaching did not lie in a new understanding of what was and was not allowed, but in a deeper insight into what is going on in the human heart. What about the exception? Jesus' words in Matthew 5 and 19 clearly express the same disapproval of divorce and remarriage as we heard in Mark chapter 10. However, the words "except on the ground of sexual immorality indicate that this disapproval was not absolute and without exception. It's not always the case that one who divorces his wife and marries another commits adultery. The exception in Matthew 5 and Matthew 19, except on the ground of sexual immorality, is vague. Porneia is a word with a wide range of meanings. Sexual immorality is not a bad translation, really. It includes adultery, but is not specifically adultery. Porneia may include other marriage-breaking sexual behaviour. In my opinion, logos porneias represents the expression translated some indecency in Deuteronomy 24 verse 1 and retains the lack of specificity. The point I'd underline here is that a married person should understand that their marriage is a lifelong commitment. The breaking of this relationship is as serious as can be stated. In most circumstances, it's equivalent to adultery, just as looking with lustful intent is equivalent to adultery. However, there are circumstances in which divorce and remarriage is allowed by Jesus, just as it was allowed by Moses. At least some of those circumstances are suggested but not clearly defined by the words logos porneias. It's like Jesus teaching about anger and murder. They're generally profoundly linked expressions of our sinfulness in this fallen, sin-spoiled world. But that is not to say that every particular instance of anger in this sinful world is evil, nor is every act of divorce and remarriage in this sinful world condemned. On the contrary, sometimes it is allowed. Now, if we only had Mark 10 and Matthew 5 and 19, and along with Luke 16, we might conclude that all instances of divorce are immoral, or divorce and remarriage are immoral, unless they're based on a sexual offence, some kind of porneia. And here we turn to 1 Corinthians 7, which has been very ably expounded and very helpfully expounded by Philip earlier. I will pick on just a couple of points to contribute to this discussion. I want to take you to verses 10 and 11 again of 1 Corinthians 7. To the married I give this charge, not I but the Lord. The wife should not separate from her husband, but if she does, she should remain unmarried or else be reconciled to her husband, and the husband should not divorce his wife. The general principle, you see, is clear and consistent. Marriage is for life. Separation from the marriage partner is contrary to the covenant of marriage. If for some reason separation does occur, then the intention must be reconciliation. Here, I take it, Paul is passing on in different words the teaching of Jesus as it's recorded in Mark chapter 10. He's not here addressing the exceptional circumstances noted by Jesus in Matthew 5 and 19. He's giving the general teaching that we saw in Mark 10. In 1 Corinthians 7, Paul was addressing a situation rather different from the one in which Jesus confronted. In particular, there were Jews and Gentiles among the believers in Corinth, some of whom we may suppose became Christian believers subsequent to their marriages, without their spouse joining them in their new life in Christ. Paul doesn't have a direct teaching of Jesus for all situations that may arise, but he offers his apostolic instruction. If a believer is married to an unbeliever, Paul insists the marriage should continue, and the believer should be faithful to his or her spouse, provided the unbeliever agrees to go on living with him or her. And so verses 12 to 14, to the rest I say, I, not the Lord, that if any brother has a wife who is an unbeliever and she consents to live with him, he should not divorce her. If any woman has a husband who is an unbeliever and he consents to live with her, she should not divorce him, for the unbelieving husband is made holy because of his wife, and the unbelieving wife is made holy because of her husband. Otherwise your children would be unclean, but as it is, they are holy. Issues to be gone into there that we won't go into. But so far, it seems to me that Paul has not really added to what we've learnt from Jesus, except to insist that the obligations of the marriage covenant apply to such a mixed marriage, with the significant proviso that this is dependent on the willingness of the unbeliever to maintain the relationship. What about if the unbelieving spouse is not willing to maintain the marriage? Well, that's the point Paul addresses, of course, in the famous verse 15. But if the unbelieving partner separates, let it be so. In such cases, the brother or sister is not enslaved or bound, the NIV. God has called you to peace. As you know, and as you picked up from this morning's discussion, a much debated verse, I understand it to mean that should the unbeliever leave the marriage, then the believer is no longer bound to their former spouse. The force of not bound is, as Philip indicated, disputed, but even such a cautious interpreter as John Murray considers that not bound must refer to freedom from the obligations of the marriage. Here I agree, and I agree with Murray that this must in principle involve freedom to marry another. Friends, I'll try to conclude. You haven't got any questions, have you? It's all clear as crystal, uncontroversial, straightforward. Yeah, right. In my view, the Scriptures, Old and New Testaments, teach that marriage is intended by God to be lifelong and exclusive, a relationship between one man and one woman. This purpose from the beginning has not been abandoned and must be honoured. However, there are circumstances in this fallen world in which the obligations of marriage cannot be kept. And in such circumstances, these obligations may come to an end before death, and this is allowed. These obligations include forsaking all others. The tragedy, sadness, and undesirability of such circumstances can hardly be overstated. The pressing question we all want to answer, of course, is what are these circumstances? Some who would agree with much that I've said so far, I doubt that anyone will agree with it all, then insist that, but there are only two such circumstances. The so-called Matthean exception and the Pauline privilege are the only acceptable grounds for divorce and possible remarriage. In my opinion, it's not so simple. And I'd love at this point to just replay the tape of Philip's introduction to his third talk, the first 10 minutes or so, where the complexity was displayed to us. I don't believe that Old Testament or New set out to describe all possible circumstances for which divorce has been allowed. In general terms, some of these circumstances are indicated, but they're not precisely defined, and there's no reason to think that those mentioned cover all possibilities. Every such situation is deeply distressing. Personally, and I'm sure it's true for most of us here, you only have to let your mind wander to some of the situations you've encountered, perhaps some of them that have been very close and that brings tears to your eyes. There is no such circumstance which is a happy one. But the appropriateness of a divorce, as well as of a second marriage after a divorce, has to be a matter of careful, godly wisdom rather than a law. We'd all love to be given a law. We'd all love it to be black and white. We'd all love to be able to answer it by giving a questionnaire with tick boxes, and then from the boxes we'd be able to get our answer, but I don't believe it ever works like that. That means it'll be complicated. Yep, that's right. But we do more harm than good, in my opinion, when we relieve ourselves of the complexity by resorting to simple rules. Let me conclude, and this isn't a very good idea really, must have had it in the middle of the night or something, but I'll conclude by reiterating the points I made earlier that I recognise to be more difficult for some of us. This is the wrong note to finish on, but I'm going to finish on it because that's where we're going. Because the things that I haven't put down, the things that we agree on, are so important. So please put this together with the earlier statement where the other points were there. But these are the points that I believe are particularly difficult for a good number of us anyway, that I've concluded. They were points 4, 5, 7, 8 and 9. They go like this. In our fallen world, circumstances can arise in which it may not be possible for a marriage to be lifelong, and I've given the example. Therefore, in our fallen world, God has allowed divorce, that is, the ending of a marriage before death. Divorce is not always reprehensible, often is, but not always. It's been allowed by God with a recognition of our hardness of heart, that is, our fallen sinful natures, for those situations where it is not humanly possible for a marriage to be lifelong. The Bible does not provide a legal or quasi-legal definition of all the circumstances for which God has allowed divorce. It requires godly wisdom, not law, to discern what is right in any particular situation. Divorce ends a marriage. Therefore, a divorced person is in principle. This doesn't mean that it is the case in every particular case, but in principle, free to marry another. There is no more inherent virtue in a divorced person remaining unmarried than a person who has never been married. Friends, I think it's time for questions. I didn't manage the cleverness of Philip to actually fill up the entire time. I would have... He pretended that he thought lunch was 1 o'clock, you know. He knew. Microphones are going to come round, I believe, for questioners. That'll save me repeating them. And so just down the front here, I think, Tim.
John, I don't at all mean this to be a funny comment, so I hope no one laughs. I just wonder if this is something we want to guide people through the messy process and give people their freedom in Christ to do what is right under God, and that if a pastor has spent time with a divorced man or woman and is happy to consent with the possibility of remarriage, is there any wisdom, you think, in putting forward some kind of divorce ceremony? And what I mean by that is that when we marry people, in the marriage ceremony, we are celebrating Christ's marriage to the church. We're teaching people in that marriage service something more than simply a man and woman being bonded. I wonder if it may not be something ridiculous that comes to our minds, but just something that is done publicly in the church to bless the future of that individual.
Thank you, brother. My immediate suspicion is it would just be practically too complicated and impossible to do. There are many, many pastoral situations. Philip outlined some there this morning where you start to learn a little bit, but even when you get to the point that he described, you're still not quite sure that you know the whole picture. And I do think that the practicalities involved and I don't think, but should we as a Christian fellowship be praying for people who are going through divorce? Certainly. I'm not sure that we need a ceremony for it, but should we be beside people, understanding them as best they can, rebuking them where necessary, correcting them, calling them to repentance where necessary, standing with them, and not being judgmental when that is right. We ought to be doing that, so the person who is going through this terrible experience ought not to be ostracised from the Christian fellowship. But I'm not sure at all myself, I'm not at all attracted, I must say, to the idea of setting up a ceremony for that.
Ceremony was the wrong word to use.
Yeah, but
including the body of believers in the decisions.
None of this should a believer be required to go through on their own, unless they are rebellious. If this is evidence of a rebellious life standing against God and defying him and unfaithfulness, they may well need to be excluded from the fellowship. And that is often the case. But it's not always the case. And that's what's so difficult for us. Yeah.
John,
Where are you?
To your left.
Over here. Thank you.
When you were looking at Mark 10, and because of your hardness of heart, he wrote you this commandment. You spoke of hardness of heart as just kind of general human sinfulness, and I wondered if the hardness of heart was more particular than just sort of general sinfulness.
Well, no, I don't think it is. That is, tell me if I've got the way you're going. Some people think that it means because you are so hard-hearted and you're determined to do it, okay, I'll let you do it. I think the hardness of heart that is determined to divorce, well, Moses allowed it. Okay, can you imagine him allowing adultery for the same reason? Because you're so determined to commit adultery, I'll allow it. What's allowed in particular circumstances, the circumstances may be terrible, the circumstances may be sinful, the circumstances are undesirable, the circumstances may be reprehensible, but an action that is allowed in the circumstances, in my opinion, can't be regarded in itself as sinful. Okay, so hardness of heart, I don't know how to establish more specifically what it means, but it's certainly a reference to our sinful condition. It's at least that. Did you want to come back on that? Okay, thank you. Yeah, yep.
John, given the framework of your thinking that you've given us, can you take us through Matthew chapter 19, verses 10 to 12, that the outplay with Jesus and his disciples about if that is the case, then it's better for a man not to marry. So they're obviously understanding that this is pretty tough, what Jesus has put to them. So what's the import of what Jesus is saying there? Only some can bear to hear this.
Yeah. I think that my understanding of that is not different to anybody else's. That is to say, Jesus is setting a very high bar. He is saying that marriage is for life. Marriage isn't a sort of opt-in clause with all sorts of possible opt-out clauses within it. Marriage is for life. I've been thinking very carefully about how much Philip and I disagree, and I'm not sure how much we do disagree. And I apologise again that we haven't sat down and worked that out. But I found myself in complete agreement with everything we got in talks 1 and 2, and I think I might be in complete agreement with everything we got in talk 3. Okay, and again he'll have to speak for himself. But it's good to have an opportunity to interpret him to you. I understood him to be saying, God's word about divorce is don't do it. You don't get married with the freedom to divorce. What about the messy situations? Well, the additional thing that has to be said when something happens, when certain circumstances arise, that I can't define in full, but some of those things that Philip described at the beginning in his stories, we then have to say, is this an absolute that applies in all conceivable situations in this fallen world? And I'm saying I don't see that it does. When you take Old Testament through to Jesus, through to Paul, it doesn't seem to me, when you see it in the context of the whole, that it has that absolute force that is denying the possibility. Now, I think it is the force of you get married, you stay married. That they say, in a society of easy divorce. Just imagine, gay marriage comes along. The government passes a law that says, okay, gay marriage is allowed, but it's for life and there's no way out. Won't be many people wanting to take it up. They say, better to not be married. Okay? So the obligations of marriage are huge. The seriousness with which we must take those obligations are huge. And many will say, well, maybe it's better not to take them on at all. Bruce.
Thank you very much, John. Can I request that you and Philip get together and publish an article and put it on the Priscilla Aquila and Priscilla website, something you're doing together? I'd really love to see that. It's actually a serious suggestion. The question, though, is the pastoral side. Because on the pastoral side, you often, the circumstance is so often that you really don't have a clue the other side of the story. You only, people come to you, they say, we want to get married, There's a divorce in the story, but you really have no way of accessing the other side of it. It's not usually something, or it's very often not something that's happened in the context of the congregation that you're a part of. Have you any wisdom in that?
Only wisdom is do your best. Do your best. Friends, you know that I'm just sharing with you the convictions that I've come to, but I would say do not resort to a quick rule. Do not resort to quick and simple answers to this. I'm sorry, I'm not meaning to caricature the alternative point of view of those quick and simple. Nobody thinks it's quick and simple, but bringing a rule to bear, like an absolute rule, no divorce, or a rule, no remarriage after divorce, that's the sort of shortcut. In my opinion, it really is just much more complicated than that. Your advice will not be infallible, but you do your best to know as much as you can, to make what inquiries you can, and give the godly counsel that you can. And sometimes it will be, friend, you should not marry again. I'll give that advice sometimes to a widower. You really should not marry again. It's my advice. It's not a law. It's not a rule. You shouldn't marry again. Very often, the advice to somebody who has come to you will be, divorce is not an option for you, friend. You just keep working at it. There's no need for you to, that is not what you should do. But working out what the pastoral counsel is, I say as a matter of godly wisdom, you haven't got a law to use which would make it, in one sense, a great deal easier for us if we did. Robert, can you grab a microphone from somebody?
I've got one here,
You've got one.
thanks.
Go ahead.
One of my jobs is to advise clergy on the rightness of remarriage.
Of a remarriage? Thank
Bishops get asked about not about divorce. That's always happened by the time we get involved.
Yes.
I have to share your views very substantially, but one of the techniques is to find out, is there a marriage or not?
Yes.
In particular, and this is why having the minister having a form to talk to people about enables him to ask them questions that otherwise may seem intrusive, this particularly for outsiders. Is this really a divorce and remarriage, where what we're doing, we're being asked to bless an adultery, or is this a situation where there's really no more marriage and we're being asked whether the person is free in church law in Christian law to marry?
And
although in our case, the clergyman himself must be convinced. We don't have a rule for the diocese that of all. It's just that if the minister's convinced and there's no scandal, in my own region, I will normally advise that go ahead if you think it's wise.
that's a comment?
Yep, that's
Thank you, Robert. No way, in my opinion, of making this situation unmessy. And it's possible that a bishop's job is temptation to make things unmessy, to keep the paperwork clean and neat, but it can't be done. So even the situation where I'm not suggesting that the kind of approach that I now gets rid of the messy problems, a way through the messy problems. The person comes and wants to marry this person who has always been on the scene and is in fact the reason for the divorce. And you say, actually, that is not right. They go and marry them. How do you treat the marriage? See, it's messy. No simple answers to this. Yes.
John, I think I think I've remarried about 6 or so couples. Sorry, I think I've officiated the marriages of 6 or so couples that have previously been divorced, or one of them has. But I was just kind of playing out in my mind, maybe you could, and I've had the awkward conversation about the history of what's happened each time. I wonder if you could kind of perhaps present a scenario where you might say no to a remarriage.
I've had several. I'm sorry, the one that I was about to describe is so recognisable for anybody who knows it, I won't. I think if I'm presented, I'll have to put it in the most general terms, if I'm presented with somebody who, in my judgment, is unrepentant for any wrong in the past and is about to enter into a willful defiance of God's honouring of marriage, I'm not going to be part of it. but that's difficult to discern. We've got to finish up. I just wanted to finish with this, friends. Some of you know, and thank you for your interest because you keep asking me. I've been working on 2 Samuel for some time. Finished it, actually. Well, I've heard. I was almost moved to tears at one point at my study looking at the Hebrew. How about that, eh? When I saw God's treatment of David. Do you know the marriage of David, and he had several, the one that God blessed most was Bathsheba? How can that be? It is the grace of God that can accomplish things we cannot imagine. And we mustn't come to a situation where our way of doing things in the name of righteousness can't recognise what the grace of God can do. Yes, righteousness matters. But I said in the paper at some point, the righteousness of God is the grace of God. The grace of God is the righteousness of God. Does that give us simple answers? No. It just makes it harder for us to cope with. But the grace of God is extraordinary. And nothing before that grace of God is hopeless. Thanks.